Hi, my name is Gibson, and I'm the creator of the Personal Development School. This is your daily breakthrough video, and in this video, we are going to talk about the top 5 major triggers for anxious, preoccupied, attachment style individuals. So, if you're new to this channel, I create daily breakthrough videos for you to basically reprogram at the subconscious level different painful habits or patterns that exist within your life and your relationships. And I talk a lot specifically about attachment styles because this tends to give us deeper insight into our childhood patterns, things that we were programmed with, how they impact us, and then what we need to change in our personal lives and the relationship to ourselves, as well as our relationships to others. So let's talk about the top 5 triggers. So number 1, I bet most of you can guess that the primary trigger for anxious, preoccupied individuals is I will be abandoned. So anytime there's a change in a pattern, anytime there is a shift in behavior, there is less communication than usual, there is more coldness than usual, something shifts towards a disconnect, any form of disconnection, even things like taking more space, the potential of somebody moving further away, taking a job, having to work more hours, these sorts of things, all of these things tend to trigger this fear that you could be disconnected or that you could be abandoned. And this, for the nervous system of an anxious, preoccupied individual, when they suffered in the past some kind of abandonment in their early childhood or upbringing, whether this was like perceived abandonment because there was just a big incongruency where sometimes caregivers were really loving and sometimes they were really withdrawn, or they were really loving and then they worked a lot. Like anytime there's a big perceived abandonment that's repetitive, repetition really programs the subconscious mind. So even if there weren't like these overt, severe forms of abandonment that took place, this can still be a major wound if there was just consistent perceived abandonment. And abandonment, when we have these early associations at a subconscious level, usually what's taking place is like the idea of being abandoned in childhood when you're completely dependent on your caregivers to survive also triggers feelings of being unsafe. And so whenever there's a chance for abandonment, potential for abandonment, often what happens inside of an anxious, preoccupied individual is they become very triggered, very afraid, and they feel panicky and literally unsafe because those fears and those ideas have sort of like been melded together and associated with one another over time at a very young age. And that was usually the way that they imprinted the subconscious mind. So that's primary trigger number 1. Number 2, being alone. So this will be more feelings of like loneliness, even if you know you're not being abandoned, your partner's checked in, your friends are there, but you've moved to a new city or everybody's away for the weekend or whatever it might be. The feeling of being alone and loneliness can be a big piece of triggering for anxious, preoccupied individuals. And this is largely because this is your shadow self. And I have a ton of really in-depth work on like healing the shadow self, being able to heal these things at a really deep level, in like profound breakthrough work. And it's our shadow work course. It's called Overcoming Unworthiness by Understanding and Accepting Your Shadow. And it's of course about self-love and ending the habits of abandonment that take place within our relationship to ourselves, and understanding when other people trigger us. Sometimes this has a lot to do with patterns that exist within us. If you want to check out that course, there's a link in the description box below to our all access membership pass that gives you a 7-day free trial, literally to check everything out. You get access to all the different courses, but you also get access to the shadow work course, which I highly recommend doing as an anxious, preoccupied individual. I also recommend for APs, the Reprogramming Your Attachment Style course, the How to Self-Love course. It's literally just about self-love, and the How to Repair Any Relationship course. And this includes relationship to self. So all of that's included in the 7-day trial. So you can check out the link below. It's a much deeper dive than any content on here. So the reason that this like I am alone idea becomes the shadow is because usually the anxious, preoccupied individual is out of relationship to themselves. They're usually not very tapped in, tuned into their own feelings, their own needs, their own boundaries, their own narratives. They usually aren't very present with themselves, trying to show up for themselves and support themselves. And this makes them much more dependent on people outside of them because there's this lack of being able to depend on the relationship to the inside of self. And oftentimes too, there's all these forms of people pleasing that exist. And the more you're people pleasing, the more there is this like form of self-betrayal taking place, which again, further puts you out of relationship to self. So usually anxious, preoccupied individuals, they feel lonely because they're not connected to the person they're alone with. And this is part of why this becomes a big trigger for anxious, preoccupied. Number 3, feeling rejected is a big one. And this is obviously really painful because of the meaning the anxious, preoccupied individual gives. So these can be like major rejections, like a breakup, but this can also be a minor rejection, like not getting the job you wanted, or which can also be a pretty major rejection too. But like, let's say, for example, there is a rejection just in terms of somebody saying, no, I can't hang out on the weekend. Sorry. These things can actually cut a little deeper for the anxious, preoccupied individual because they really give meaning to it. And a lot of their identity as APs depends on like the people around them. Like so much of an anxious individual's identity is anxious, preoccupied is, do people like me? Am I included? Do people think I'm good and worthy and wanted and enough? And it makes for this like fragile sense of self and self-concept, because you may be really loved and really valued by many people and have tons of amazing traits and qualities going for you. But if somebody's having a bad day, and so they're a little more critical than usual, or the world goes through a tough year, like over the past couple years, and people are more withdrawn and they're not showing up to like let you know that they think that you're great, or they're not able to be present because their emotional bandwidth has shrunken because they're going through things in their life, then because your sense of self is so dependent on other people, if things are happening in those people's lives, it can really affect your sense of self, because it's like, oh, I'm feeling rejected by people that I love, so I must not be worth anything. And this can be really, really difficult for the anxious, preoccupied. And honestly, nobody should have to live like that or feel like that. So it's really important as well that if you are an anxious, preoccupied individual, that you do that work to show up for yourself so that you can make your sense of self identity dependent on you and your boundaries and your needs, and being tuned in and able to self-soothe. And again, reprogramming your anxious attachment style course inside PDS is a great place to start for that. Highly recommend. And trigger number 3, feeling not good enough or disliked. So if somebody, it's funny because sometimes, like, as a human being, there's just going to be people who don't like you, who just don't love you, who don't think that, and it can be because your qualities or traits remind them of their mom that they have triggered wounds with, or their dad that they never got along with, or whatever it might be, like, or their best friend who betrayed them. Like, we can have reasons that we don't get along with people or click with people that have nothing to do with the person itself, that have to do with our own subconscious wounds and previous programs. And so something that can happen is, anxious, preoccupied individuals, and they feel disliked or excluded, these can be so triggering, and they usually make it mean, oh, I'm not good enough. If only I were more, if only I were better, if only, and it's like taking all this blame for everything, as opposed to being able to see that sometimes things aren't about whether you're good enough or not good enough. Sometimes there's more to our interactions and interpersonal relationship dynamics that are so beyond one individual being perfect enough or not. And so because that's a reality, because how we can click and connect with people has so much more to do with than just that single person and their traits, it's also another painful position to put yourself in, because it's like, if you're the AP and somebody doesn't like you because they are jealous of you, or because you remind them of some person they had problems with in the past, or because their emotional bandwidth is shrunken and they don't have that ability to like really open up to you or connect with you, and you take it as feeling disliked or excluded, you often take that experience and that interaction and accidentally use it to diminish your sense of self-worth by telling yourself, well, it's because I'm not good enough, because I'm not perfect, when that's not always what's going on whatsoever. So it's important to recognize that that can be a big trigger for APs. And then last but not least, being dismissed. This usually triggers feelings of being unseen, unnoticed, ignored. And again, when we go back to that idea that so much of the anxious, preoccupied's personality and sense of self is dependent on people as, seeing them as good and valuable and enough, then when there's a feeling of being dismissed or stonewalled or disconnected, then it can really hurt that individual's sense of self-worth. So hopefully this all makes sense. There's so much more to talk about in this whole discussion and topic, but again, there's a lot of deep dive information if you want to check out some of our 7-day free trial inside of the school and do a deeper dive into the reprogramming parts of these components. And thank you so much for being here. Please like, share, and subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you in the next video.